Okay, so you're ready to dive into The Big Short, huh? Get ready, because Michael Lewis does not pull any punches. This book, it's about to take you on a wild ride through the subprime mortgage crisis. And let me tell you, it's way more than just a few bad mortgages. We're talking about a whole system on the verge of collapse.
You got it. The Big Short does an incredible job at showing how all these seemingly unrelated people and events, they all collide to create this perfect storm. And the scary part is this wasn't just a case of a few bad apples. This was a whole rotten orchard.
Totally. And right at the center of it all, you've got these larger-than-life characters who somehow saw it coming. Guys like Steve Eisman. This guy, he was brilliant but cynical, and he could smell a bad investment a mile away.
Eisman, he's a pivotal figure in all this. And what's fascinating is how he and guys like Mike Burry, this data whiz, they basically stumbled onto this massive mispricing in the market. It's like they found a hidden doorway that everyone else just walked right past.
Okay, hold on, I gotta ask, how could everyone else be so blind to what was happening? It just seems impossible.
Right. You would think. Lewis does a great job of illustrating this with this story about Eisman meeting Ken Lewis, the CEO of Bank of America. So Eisman goes into this meeting expecting, a meeting of the minds, right? But as he's listening to Ken Lewis talk, it hits him. This guy has no clue about the risk his own bank is carrying. This wasn't just about bad loans. This was about a system where even the people at the top didn't understand the game they were playing.
That's terrifying. So how did this happen? How did this massive blind spot develop in the first place?
Well, one factor was this lack of historical awareness. See, back in the early 90s, there were only a couple Wall Street analysts who really dedicated their time to understanding what happens when you start giving credit to less creditworthy borrowers.
Okay, so these were the real pioneers of subprime analysis.
Exactly. One of them, Cy Jacobs, actually went through the same Salomon Brothers training program as Michael Lewis, believe it or not. He worked for this small investment bank called Alex Brown,
Hmm.
and he talks about how he learned about this, well, he calls it an amazing new securitization model that Louis Ranieri was developing. He's the godfather of mortgage bonds.
Okay, sounds like a game changer.
Oh, it was revolutionary. Imagine taking something as simple as a home mortgage and turning it into this bond, a tradable asset. It was financial alchemy. And this concept, it quickly spread to other types of debt, like credit card receivables and aircraft leases, even gym memberships.
Yeah.
And naturally, the next step was to tap into the equity locked up in homes with first mortgages.
Ah, so that's where the second mortgage market exploded.
Exactly. And the idea behind subprime, as Jacobs put it, was to remove the stigma from second mortgages. The initial thought was, hey, if we mass market these bonds, we can actually lower the costs for borrowers, allowing them to, consolidate their high-interest debt with lower-interest mortgage debt.
Right, so it's a win-win, right? Lower costs, more people owning homes. What could go wrong?
You've hit the nail on the head. That's the million-dollar question.
Hmm.
How did a seemingly good idea go so horribly wrong?
Yeah, unpack that for me. How did this system, designed to make homeownership more accessible, turn into, well, a ticking time bomb?
This is where things get really interesting, and this is where The Big Short really shines, by focusing on the players. This new market, it attracted a whole new breed of financial players, and they were more interested in exploiting the system for profit than actually helping people achieve the dream of homeownership.
So it wasn't about making mortgages accessible anymore. It was about making money at any cost.
Exactly. And they figured out how to package these risky loans to make them look safer than they actually were. That's where these collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs, come in. Imagine a basket of loans, some good, some bad. But instead of keeping them separate, they blended them all together, hiding the worst of the worst of the subprime mortgages inside these CDOs.
It's like mixing a perfectly good apple with a rotten one and then trying to sell it as a gourmet fruit salad.
Perfect analogy. And to make matters worse, they convinced these rating agencies, Moody's and S&P, to give these CDOs a AAA rating, basically saying, hey, these are as safe as government bonds.
Wait, hold on. The same agencies that are supposed to be the gatekeepers of risk were complicit in this.
Oh, it gets worse. These rating agencies were being paid by the very people selling the CDOs. Talk about a conflict of interest. So, of course, they had every incentive to keep those ratings high, even if the underlying assets were, to put it mildly, garbage.
And this is where that character Wing Chow comes in, right? The CDO manager who Lewis describes as having a voracious appetite for risk.
You got it. Chow ran this firm called Harding Advisory. And get this, his main goal, it wasn't to make sure the CDOs were actually any good. It was to maximize the amount of dollars he managed. He was more interested in the size of his empire than the quality of the bricks it was built with.
It's incredible how short-sighted some of these players were.
It really is. Lewis describes this incredible dinner that Eisman has with Chow, where Chow basically admits to this. He tells Eisman straight up that he'd rather have $50 billion in crappy CDOs than none at all.
Hmm.
Can you imagine? It was at that moment that Eisman realized just how rigged the entire system had become.
So not only were these subprime mortgages ticking time bombs, but they were being bundled into even riskier investments, rubber-stamped by conflicted rating agencies, and managed by people who cared more about quantity over quality. It's mind-blowing that this was even allowed to happen.
It's a classic case of a bubble, and we know how those usually end. But what's even more alarming is that these subprime loans themselves were practically designed to implode.
Wait, what do you mean? How are they designed to fail?
Well, think about it. Lenders were offering these really tempting low teaser interest rates for the first few years. But then they jacked them up to these much higher go-to rates later on.
So borrowers, they were essentially lured in with the promise of these affordable payments, but then they get hit with this massive increase later on that they couldn't afford. It was a debt trap.
Exactly. They were enticed by these low initial rates, but they often couldn't handle the payments once those rates reset, leading to, well, a wave of defaults and foreclosures.
It's like these borrowers were being set up to fail from the very beginning.
Unfortunately, that's what it looks like. And all of this is happening while the rest of the economy seemed to be booming. The dot-com bubble had burst, sure, but people were still optimistic. They thought the good times would never end.
So everyone was just happily ignoring the warning signs flashing right in front of their faces.
Pretty much. It was a classic case of what they call irrational exuberance. People wanted to believe that the good times would keep rolling, that house prices would only go up, and this belief, this almost willful blindness, it created an environment where very few people even dared to question if any of this was sustainable.
But some people, like Eisman, they were starting to see the cracks in the facade, right? They realized this wasn't just a market correction. This was a disaster just waiting to happen.
And the people who saw it coming, well, they were about to make a fortune betting against the system. But that's a story for another time.
Come on, you can't leave me hanging like that. But before we move on, I gotta ask, how did Eisman go from this cynical stock analyst to someone who understood the complexities of the bond market? That seems like a huge leap.
You're right. It was a huge transition for him. For years, he was laser-focused on the stock market. But as he went deeper into this world of subprime, he had this epiphany. He realized that the real action, the real power, it wasn't in stocks, it was in bonds.
So he saw that it wasn't about individual companies anymore. It was about the entire financial system.
Exactly. He famously said, the fixed income world dwarfs the equity world. The equity world is like a thingzit compared to the bond market. It was in the bond market where trillions were being made and lost, and where the fate of the whole financial system was being decided.
Wow. That's a powerful realization. It's like he had been playing checkers his whole life and then suddenly discovered the game of chess.
Exactly. And this realization was a turning point for Eisman. He shifted his focus from stocks to bonds, from analyzing companies to trying to understand this massive, complex market that most people didn't even know existed.
And his timing couldn't have been better because he was about to stumble onto the opportunity of a lifetime. All right, so Eisman's hot on the trail of this massive systemic risk. He knows something is rotten in the state of mortgage-backed securities. But how do you actually bet against an entire market? That just doesn't even seem possible.
Yeah, it's not as easy as just betting against a company's stock, right? This was a whole different animal. This market, it was designed to be confusing, complex, like a maze with walls made of financial jargon.
So how did Eisman and these other guys even begin to navigate this maze?
They had to become financial detectives. They spent months, years even, picking apart these prospectuses, analyzing all this data, talking to anyone who might have even a tiny bit of insight into this really shadowy market. They were relentless, absolutely determined to uncover the cracks in this seemingly impenetrable facade.
It's like they were piecing together this puzzle, searching for these clues that nobody else even knew existed.
Exactly. They were looking for any indication that these bonds were as risky as they suspected, and they were willing to go to some pretty extraordinary lengths to find them. Remember Eisman's, what he called his great treasure hunt?
Refresh my memory.
He was digging through the balance sheets of these huge financial institutions, trying to figure out who was holding the bag, who had the most exposure to these toxic assets.
Sounds like something straight out of a movie.
It really does. And it wasn't just about crunching numbers either. They were out there hitting the pavement, talking to people, trying to get firsthand accounts of what was going on. They knew that sometimes the best information comes from actual human intelligence, not just spreadsheets.
They knew that to really understand a system built by people, you have to look beyond just the numbers and try to understand the human element.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Eisman's infamous dinner with Wing Chao. This wasn't just a social call. This was a fact-finding mission for Eisman.
So what did he find out? What happened at this dinner?
This dinner was a turning point for Eisman. He went in hoping to get some insight into how Chao managed risk, but what he got was a front-row seat to the delusion that had gripped Wall Street.
What do you mean delusion?
Chao basically admitted that he didn't fully understand the risks of the CDOs he was managing, or even scarier, he just didn't care. He was so focused on short-term gains, on building this empire of CDOs, that he completely disregarded the long-term consequences. It was greed, plain and simple, trumping common sense.
That's terrifying. It's like he was playing with dynamite and had no idea it could explode.
You got it. And remember those rating agencies we talked about, the ones that were supposed to be the independent watchdogs? They were basically enabling this behavior by giving these risky investments their stamp of approval. The whole system was designed for disaster.
Okay, so these investors, they've done the work, they've seen the writing on the wall, they know this market's going to crash. But how do they actually make money from it? They can't just snap their fingers and make it all disappear.
Right. They couldn't just short these mortgage bonds. That's what you'd normally do if you thought an asset would lose value.
So how'd they do it?
Credit default swaps. CDSs.
Okay.
Think of them like insurance policies on those risky mortgage bonds. These CDSs, they were the key. They were betting on the bonds to fail.
So it's like taking out an insurance policy on your neighbor's house because you're pretty sure it's going to burn down.
Exactly. They were paying a premium for these CDSs, and if the bonds defaulted, they would get a huge payout. And if the bonds didn't fail, well, they'd be out the premium. But they were willing to take that risk. High risk, high reward. But even getting your hands on these CDSs, it couldn't have been easy, right? It's not like they were just available through your regular stockbroker.
No, it was not a typical Wall Street transaction. The CDS market was relatively new, it was obscure, and a lot of the big firms, they were really hesitant to even sell these things.
Wait, really? Why not? If someone wants to buy, isn't that a good thing?
You'd think, right? But these firms, they were essentially betting against their own products. It was in their best interest to keep up this illusion that these mortgage bonds were safe and profitable.
So they were stuck.
Hmm.
Either profit from selling these CDSs or protect their other products.
Exactly. And that created a real obstacle for investors like Eisman and Burry. They had to be really persistent, always searching for the right people, the firms that were willing to take the other side of their bet, even if it meant potentially undermining their other products. I can't imagine those conversations went over well.
I'm sure they were interesting. Lewis actually spends a lot of time in the book talking about how Mike Burry, in his own, let's say, unconventional way, basically pestered Goldman Sachs and Bank of America for weeks until they finally agreed to sell in these CDSs.
So even when they had their suspicions confirmed, they had the financial tools to make the bet, they still had to fight just to get in the game.
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated. Even when they found someone to sell them these CDSs, they ran into another problem. The market wasn't reflecting what was actually happening.
What do you mean? Weren't the CDS prices reflecting how risky these mortgage bonds actually were?
That's what you'd think, right? But the market was still in denial. These CDS prices, they were way too low considering the enormous risk. It was like the whole financial world was wearing rose-colored glasses, just totally ignoring all the warning signs.
So not only were they going up against some of the most powerful institutions in the world, they were also fighting against the collective delusion of the entire market.
Exactly. It was a crazy situation. They were making these bets that were paying off. Their analysis was right, but the market wasn't acknowledging it. These firms were marking their positions against them, refusing to admit the true value of their trades.
It's like playing a game where the rules constantly change to benefit the people who are already winning.
That's a good way to put it. And nobody felt that frustration more than Mike Burry. He was convinced that the firms were manipulating the market, that they were keeping the CDS prices artificially low on purpose. He actually accused them of fraud.
Wow. So what happened? What did he do?
Even with all the pressure and skepticism from his investors and the market in general, Burry stood firm. He was so sure of his analysis, so convinced that eventually the truth would come out, that he doubled down on his bets. He weathered the storm and waited for the market to catch up to reality.
And did it.
It did. And when that subprime market finally started to unravel in 2007, the price of those CDSs skyrocketed. It all came crashing down. And those who saw it coming, who had the courage, I guess, to bet against the system, they were about to make a fortune.
It's amazing. These handful of people, armed with nothing but their intellect and their persistence and a healthy dose of skepticism, were able to take on the entire financial system.
It just shows the power of independent thinking, especially in the face of everyone else believing something else. They weren't afraid to ask tough questions and to challenge conventional wisdom and ultimately to bet against everyone else.
And they were right, and everybody else was wrong.
But it wasn't just about the money, though that is hard to ignore, the fortunes they made. For a lot of these guys, it was about exposing what was wrong with the system. The greed, the recklessness, how they disregarded risk, all of that had infected Wall Street, and they wanted to hold these people accountable.
It was their David versus Goliath moment. And they won. But what about the other side of that? Who are all these people buying these risky mortgage bonds?
That's a great question. And it leads us even further down the rabbit hole. It turns out a lot of the buyers, they were the institutions that were supposed to be the most risk-averse. Banks, insurance companies, even pension funds. These are the entities that were supposed to be responsible for our financial well-being. And they were the ones fueling this ticking time bomb.
That's shocking. These institutions are built on being stable and careful. What were they thinking?
It's simple. The allure of high returns, that whisper in your ear that says, this time it's different. They were blinded by the thought of making easy money, tricked by those AAA ratings from the agencies into thinking it was all safe. They either didn't understand the risks, or even worse, they chose to ignore them. And as we're about to find out, this wasn't just a few rogue institutions. This had spread to the very heart of the global financial system.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. Tell me more. So we've got these investors betting against the subprime market, these Wall Street firms taking their money, and all these institutions gobbling up those risky mortgage bonds. It's a recipe for disaster, but what about the government? They weren't just watching all this happen, right?
It's the big question, isn't it? The government's role in this whole thing. It's complicated, to say the least, and people are still arguing about it today. I mean, on the one hand, they were encouraging home ownership, right? Making it easier to get mortgages, especially through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
Right, making the American dream a reality. But I bet there's a but coming.
Haha, you know it. The thing is, their intentions, they were good, but they ended up creating this system where lenders were encouraged to, well, lower their standards, make riskier loans, because, hey, if the government's backing these mortgages, what's the risk, right?
So they basically poured gasoline on the fire.
Exactly. And then it gets worse, because once those warning signs started popping up, once it was clear something was really wrong, the government, they were slow to react. They didn't want to believe how bad it really was. They kept hoping the market would just fix itself.
Like whistling past the graveyard, hoping for the best while everything's falling apart.
That's one way to put it. Everyone was in denial. The government, Wall Street, nobody wanted to admit the party was over. But eventually reality sets in. And when it did, well, it was a disaster.
So what was the turning point? When did the government realize they couldn't ignore it anymore?
Remember AIG? That massive insurance company. They were selling all those credit default swaps on those toxic mortgage bonds.
Oh yeah, the guys who are supposed to be insuring everyone else, but they forgot to insure themselves.
That's the one. Well, when that subprime market crashed, AIG was suddenly on the hook for billions, potentially trillions of dollars in payouts. And they just didn't have the money. They were about to go under, and if they went, the whole financial system could have gone with them.
That is the definition of too big to fail.
The biggest. So the government had this impossible choice. Let AIG collapse and risk total financial meltdown, or bail them out.
And they bailed them out.
They did. And it wasn't just AIG. They ended up bailing out a bunch of these giant financial institutions that they decided were, quote, systemically important, meaning if they failed, we were all screwed. They pumped trillions of dollars into the economy to try to stop a full-blown depression.
That's insane. The government had never done anything like that before, right?
Never on that scale.
Yeah.
And a lot of people were furious. They were saying, you're bailing out the very institutions that caused this mess, that were gambling with other people's money. It felt like Wall Street got away with murder while everyone else was left to clean up the mess.
So the government swooped in, saved the day, at least for the moment. But did they actually fix anything? Or was it just a temporary fix?
Good question. They did put some reforms in place, the Dodd-Frank Act, for example. The idea was to prevent this from happening again by, adding more regulation, more oversight of the financial industry, trying to rein in some of the riskier stuff that had become so normal.
So more rules, less reckless gambling with the global economy.
That was the idea, at least. But whether it actually worked is debatable. Some people say it didn't go far enough, that the financial industry, it's still too powerful, too interconnected, and those fundamental problems, they're still there.
So it's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. It might look better on the surface, but
Yeah, the subprime crisis, it exposed how fragile our whole system really is. It showed what happens with unchecked greed, how dangerous this complexity can be, and how government intervention, even when it's well-intentioned, can have some really unexpected consequences. It's a cautionary tale for sure, especially now with all these new financial tools and technologies popping up.
what's the main thing we should take away from all of this after this deep dive into the subprime crisis?
The Big Short, it's not just some history lesson about a financial crisis. It's a reminder that the people in charge, in government, on Wall Street, they don't always know what they're doing. And sometimes they're the last ones to see a disaster coming. It shows us how important it is to think for ourselves, question what we're told, and not just blindly trust authority figures, no matter how important they seem.
It reminds us that sometimes the biggest risks are hiding right in front of us, hidden in plain sight, disguised by complexity. And we have to remember that even when the players change, the game itself, it often stays the same.
Exactly. That's why this book is still so important today. It's a reminder to stay vigilant, ask questions, be wary of those bubbles, and remember that history has a way of repeating itself, especially when we forget the lessons we're supposed to learn.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Michael Lewis definitely gave us a lot to chew on. So if you're looking for a deep dive into the world of finance, a peek behind the curtain on Wall Street, and a cautionary tale about what happens when greed and risk get out of control, The Big Short is a must-read. It's a wild ride, full of fascinating characters, insane situations, and honestly some really disturbing truths about the world of money and the people who run it.
And maybe most important of all, it reminds us that sometimes the best questions are the ones nobody else is asking.
And on that note, we're out of time for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, stay curious and keep asking those tough questions.